study together, and we learn together, we work together, and we prosper together.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our viewers joining from around the world. My name is Dorothy Mora, and I'm an academic exchange specialist with the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs, or ECA. In our chat today, sponsored by EducationUSA, we will discuss all the ways that international students can finance their studies here in the U.S. I'm joined today by Evelyn Levinson, International Admissions Director for American University here in Washington, D.C. Please ask whatever questions you have for us in the chat or on Twitter using the hashtag StudyInTheUSA. We will get to as many of your live questions as we can throughout the program. We have a lot of information to get through today, so I want to welcome Evelyn to the program and ask her some questions. She has years of experience advising international students on how to come and study in the U.S. Evelyn, when we talk about costs of study, what are the various components to that cost for undergraduate and graduate degrees?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me today. Well, basically, for both undergraduate and graduate students, some of the elements that need to be taken into account are the tuition, the actual costs of the hours of study for each semester, the fees that a university will require, which are mandatory, the living expenses that will be room and board, that means dormitories or housing on campus or off campus, and of course food if it's provided by the university or if a student has to pay for that on their own. The books, the insurance, which is very important in the United States for health insurance for students, personal and settling in expenses. Things that need to be taken account also are what part of the United States will a student be living in. The cost of living can vary greatly between the coasts of the U.S. and the center, the middle of the U.S. or the southern part of the United States. The weather would, of course, affect the expenses. If you come from a warmer climate and all of a sudden have to purchase additional clothing, things like that. For graduate students, they may be coming with or without a family, so the expenses for the dependents would have to be taken into account as well. And whether the university offers on-campus housing for graduate students, postgraduate students, or not, will also affect the budget. So really, it is a holistic, comprehensive look at not just how much the tuition costs, but everything that surrounds those 12 months of the year. Costs are usually quoted on a 9-month academic calendar. So another thing that students should look at is if they're going to stay and study over the summer, will that be an extra expense or not?
We have a question from the audience. Mohammed asks about financing his English language program at his university. Could you talk about financial aid for non-degree programs like English language programs?
Right. Okay, well, thank you. It's a good question. I am not aware of any universities offering funding through the university for English language programs. However, there are many governments where that will support English language training as part of their overall strategy for undergraduate or graduate study. So depending on the country that Mohammed or other students come from, they may be allocated 1 semester, 2 semesters, perhaps up to 3 semesters of funding from their sponsoring government, Ministry of Education for that purpose. Many times, if a student is perhaps coming through a company or an organization, that might be available. I would strongly recommend that any student interested in English language training also check with the Education USA Advising Center in home country, which may be running an English language training program, and that could save a lot on the overhead, the living expenses, so the very good quality training before the student then plans to leave for the United States. But it will be very dependent on which country the student comes from, which governments are or are not offering funding for that, and if there is some in-country support or training available at a lower cost through an office like the Education USA Center.
Thanks, Evelyn. Great answer. Daniel in the online chat says, I want to do an MBA, a Master's in Business Administration in the United States, and I'm wondering about financial support that I could get, scholarships or loans, both for tuition and living expenses. Evelyn, can you talk about what kind of financial assistance is available for graduate students?
Right. Okay. Well, thank you. Graduate study will be very dependent, of course, on the university's funding abilities. In general, there would be more funding available for doctoral level than master's level. Some MBA programs may be concentrated programs that might allow a student to finish in less than 2 years. The first place would be, of course, to check with the university and see what their policies are about graduate assistantships or research assistantships, depending how much experience the student has, also to be able to be a contribution to the program. But in general, I would say that it is, for an MBA program, going to be a little bit harder to find funding than perhaps for other programs. There are, however, one-year masters in business. They could be called MS programs, Masters of Science, or MA programs in business fields, where you could get a very good quality training in 1 year instead of 2. But the one place that I would check, of course, would be with the university's policies itself. So MBA would not be necessarily the place that a lot of funding is available. But given that there's such a variety of universities in the United States, there are private universities, there are public state-supported universities, there is a range of costs that need to be taken into account. And a really important thing, whether graduate or undergraduate, is that the quality of an education is not dependent on how much money you pay for that education. There are excellent state universities that can offer an excellent MBA or other graduate program that would be overall less expensive than perhaps at a private university. If somebody is MBA, I would say to check if they are currently employed, see if their employer can offer some cost share with an incentive that this person, when they come back to their company, will maybe be required to contribute some time to that organization. So that would be specific to an MBA program.
Thank you. Great advice. Aya is asking about getting a full scholarship in the U.S. after he graduates high school. Evelyn, what kind of financial aid and scholarships are available for international undergraduate students?
Right. Well, a very popular question, and unfortunately one there, with over 4,300 universities in the U.S., there is a very, very small percentage of universities that will offer full scholarships. That is the unfortunate reality of studies. That's not to say that they're not available, but one place I would start, again, would be to go back to the Education USA Advising Center that would have resources that have been gathered over the years of universities that have a tendency to offer full or almost full scholarships. I'll be happy to talk about some strategies later as well, but when it comes to full scholarships, the reality check is that there is a very limited number of students, and the criteria could be a combination of factors. First, outstanding academics, leadership, English language skills. So the student would have to be an amazing student. But many times there are scholarships that could be based on diversity factors, that a university is looking to bring more students from a certain part of the world that they may not have had before, or they may have an endowment and a benefactor who is dedicating a certain amount of money to a student who comes from an underrepresented area. So one would be to look at the university's websites, to contact the international admissions office to ask them about that, but to first research the website before asking the questions, to ask the Education USA Advising Center, but to be ready for the fact that there is going to be a very short list with very large criteria to meet the caliber of a full scholarship. There are also sports scholarships, and many students who are outstanding athletes and good students can also look for full scholarships through the athletics departments of various universities as well.
Thank you, Evelyn. We have another question from India in the chat, and the question is asking about community colleges. There are over 4,000 universities, as you said, and universities and colleges in the U.S. How do the costs vary from school to school?
Okay, well, of course, I can't go through all 4,000, but what I can say is, as I mentioned earlier, there are universities that are state public universities and colleges, including 2-year colleges and 4-year colleges, and there are universities, 4-year universities, that are private and state supported. Community college is a great way to think of as a strategy for funding education. And many community colleges have articulation agreements. That means if a student has successfully completed the first 2 years of general liberal arts study in a community college, that school has an agreement with a sister 4-year school for them to continue on and complete at the 4-year school from the same chain of universities. So community college is a great way to start and make it more affordable. The tuition will usually be much less. The possible downside is that not every community college, actually the majority, do not offer housing, so the student would have to look for off-campus housing. But when they do the bottom line math, it can still come out to be much more affordable to start and then transition to a 4-year university, whether public or private. So the range will vary greatly overall. All those costs that I mentioned earlier, anywhere from $30,000 to $60,000 a year, but there's such a variation in between there as well.
And of course, community colleges would be much less.
On the lower end, absolutely, absolutely.
Another viewer asks, is it possible to get a scholarship to study for a master's degree if you change the field of your studies?
Right, these are great questions. So I would say that one of the ways that graduate departments determine the good fit for scholarships is to see that the interested student is also interested in the fields of research or study offered by that department. If a student is switching, they may not meet or have the sufficient background. They may be admissible, but not necessarily admissible for scholarship, because scholarships from the graduate departments will be research or teaching assistantships. If you come from the same field and you're interested in a specific piece of research, and that's what that department is doing, you're a really good fit to continue working with them and possibly getting some scholarship. If you're coming and switching fields, you may not be the right fit. At the same time, it very much depends. If you're going from engineering to business, for example, and you have years of experience as an engineer with leadership and management skills, maybe that could be a good fit. But the first place would be to contact the departments and the graduate admissions office. And I always recommend to graduate students to do a two-pronged query approach. One, the admissions, graduate admissions, to find out what the process is. But at the same time, to contact the department after the student has done their research. Who's on faculty? What are their research specializations? I happen to have those interests as well, and I say sort of turn on a light bulb with the department to get them interested in you, the graduate student. I have what you're looking for. I have this experience, or I have these academic criteria. I would very much like to be part of your graduate program. So the faculty could get interested in the student and say, I'd like to hear more about this student for scholarships. The admissions office is going to say, okay, here's the process to make that happen. So for any graduate student, master's or PhD, do your homework on what the department is doing and who's in the department, and then contact them as well as the graduate admissions office of that institution. And hopefully there could be some connectivity.
Excellent advice to contact more than one person at the university. Thanks for all these great questions. Really keep them coming in, and using the chat space or Twitter to use the hashtag #StudyInTheUSA. Evelyn, can you talk about timelines for financial aid for both undergraduate and graduate students?
Right. Well, you know, I always say you have to plan ahead. A perfect timeline, optimal, is 18 months ahead of time. I know that in many, many parts of the world, that seems so unrealistic, because in your own country, you only maybe need to plan starting in April to be able to join a university that same year in September. But given that the United States works on deadlines, the universities have very early deadlines, and in many cases, for students who are looking for merit scholarships or financial aid, the deadlines might be slightly earlier. Planning ahead is a really good piece of advice, and I would say no later than 12 months ahead of time, but 12 to 18 months ahead of time is when you start doing your research. You contact an Education USA advising center, you go online, you do your homework, whether undergraduate or graduate, and you also begin having conversations with your family about the affordability of an education and thinking long term. If you're an undergraduate student, you need to sort of have a plan that is a 4-year plan. If you're a master's student, about a 2-year plan, and if it's a PhD student, at least a 5-year plan, depending on the field that you'll be doing. So combining looking up the resources in country through Education USA, looking at the university's policies and website, and having conversations with your sponsors and or family to have a long-term plan, if that happens between 12 to 18 months ahead of time, you're in a good place.
Thanks, excellent advice. It looks like some of our online participants are asking about working while they're in school to help pay for their studies. Is it possible to work?
Right. Well, according to current visa regulations, if a student is on a student visa, they can work up to 20 hours a week on campus with permission from immigration, and there is an office on everyone's campus called the International Student and Scholar Services. So they deal with immigration regulations. They also work with programming and adapting to transitioning to a U.S. university campus. But the law does allow for up to 20 hours of week of work on a campus. Personally speaking, from the students who have worked in my office over the last 8 years, I've had a variety of students. No one student could even give me more than 14 hours a week because of the academic obligations. The first job a student has is to be a student. So getting a little job on campus, legally it's allowed. You've got to have really good time management skills, and it's good pocket money. It will not finance your education, but you can do so. Now, over the summers, a student can request permission to work off campus up to 40 hours a week on a student visa during the summer period. And summer in the United States is from mid-May till about mid or end of August. So that could be a nice period of time if the student gets the job that has been allowed him or her to do. When a student finishes their education, under the current laws, if they're on a student F1 visa, they can stay in the United States for a year and do an OPT, an optional practical training program, as long as they are employed within a certain number of weeks after graduation and in a field that is related to the degree they studied, and that they have an employer who is going to hire them. But that would be work with a salary for a year to get that experience. And after completion of every degree, they can get that 1 year of experience after a BA or an MA or a PhD. These are not going to fund the whole budget, but they're good pocket money and help cover some of those expenses that therefore the student would not have to go back to their family and ask for.
Thanks, Evelyn. That's really good to know. A question is coming into us from Twitter. It's where can graduate students get better funding from state universities or private universities?
Oh, that's a very good question, and I don't want to generalize too much, but I would say, first of all, do your homework. Research and see what the universities are offering. Not only would it vary from state universities to private universities, but it could vary from department to department, because certain departments on the graduate level may have a grant to offer, and that grant may include hiring a teaching or a research assistant in field X. But that same school, that same university in another department may not have a similar funding mechanism. So it will vary from department to department, not just public or private. But if I had to answer this question in very, very broad strokes, I would say there might be more funding opportunities at the private university level, but the overall costs at a public state university are less in the first place. So practice. If a school costs $60,000 and they're giving you a $15,000 scholarship, you still have to pay $45,000, and that includes living expenses and tuition. If another university costs $32,000, including everything, you're still better off paying for everything at a public university than the private university that is offering partial as opposed to full. So it involves doing your homework, and it will be department specific on the graduate level.
Thank you. Good advice. Ravi asks, is there financial assistance available for international students studying in a certificate program? And can you elaborate on what a certificate program is?
Okay. Well, it's a good question. And from the visa perspective, graduate students can, a certificate program is usually a non-degree program. It could be a 10-month program in strategic planning, as opposed to a 2-year master's program in engineering with a focus on strategic planning. In today's, according to today's visa regulations, certificate programs are only available to graduate students and not to graduate students for those who need a student visa. If a student happens to have a US passport or a green card, that means a permanent resident status in the United States, then these restrictions would not apply. And I'm speaking on regulations that were in effect up to maybe October 2014. If anything changes, then of course one would have to contact the International Student Scholar Services. So certificate means not leading to a degree, but it could be a very comprehensive 4-month, 6-month, 10-month, even a year program, but not for a master's or other degree. If the question was whether scholarships are available for that?
Of course, yeah.
That again almost ties in with the English language training, that it might be more restricted from the university itself. I would contact them to make sure, but my sense would be there is not too much funding available at the certificate level on the graduate side of the house. But if funding is coming from an outside source, whether it's an organization like it could be the World Health Organization, or it could be the Rotary, or it could be a government entity, or an employer who wants you to get professional development and then is bringing you back and is willing to either fund it completely or cost share with you, that might be a really good strategy to propose if you currently want to take a sabbatical for up to a year, come back and work with your company or organization at a higher level, you will have excellent training and maybe get some cost share in the process.
Great. Thank you, Evelyn. We have a question from Brazil about, I want to attend a PhD program. How are they usually financed, and what are the deadlines?
Okay, well, a PhD program, of course, again, requires a lot of planning ahead of time. And I think if I go back to my earlier recommendation, one, contacting the graduate department. Now, in US universities, as we know, it can be a very decentralized process, unlike many places in the world where it's much more centralized. One office takes care of everything. In the US, not at all. So it could be the graduate admissions office, or to contact the School of Engineering at the University of so-and-so, or the School of Communications at the University of so-and-so. So do your homework. Look at the faculty, first of all. Who is doing what in the fields that you are interested in? Is there a common denominator? Are you, PhD candidate, also interested in robotics, applications? And I'm not an engineer, so I apologize. But let's say you are interested in something in robotics and they're doing some exciting things in robotics. Then you begin that communications with the faculty member as well. The funding could be a variety of sources. As I said, they may have a grant that through that grant they can hire the student to be a teaching assistant or a research assistant. There may also be a fellowship. If you are an outstanding PhD student, I would also contact the Fulbright commissions or the Fulbright programs in your home country to see if you could qualify for a Fulbright scholarship to come and study in the US. Most planning for Fulbright scholarships will require you to apply almost 24 months ahead of time for those programs. So check with the Education USA Advising Center and or Fulbright commissions and the departments directly.
Thank you, Evelyn. Another viewer asks, do U.S. embassies offer scholarships separate from the ones that the universities themselves offer?
Well, this very much, thank you. The question very much has been answered already. The U.S. Embassy's cultural office, the public affairs office around the world may be running a variety of different programs like the Fulbright program, the Humphrey programs. So definitely I would contact the public affairs office of the U.S. Embassy or consulate in your city to see what they offer. I would check if there is a standalone Fulbright Foundation commission, a binational center, to see if there are Fulbright or other scholarships. So it wouldn't be that necessarily that the embassy is giving the money, but that they are administering a program on behalf of the US government. There could be USAID funding, there could be US State Department funding, and that is being channeled through an office in the field in your country that could be at the US Embassy or at a consulate. So definitely check and see if that money or that kind of scholarship is available.
Yeah, good idea to check with the U.S. Embassy and the Education USA centers. Thanks for all these great questions. Keep sending them in and using the chat or using Twitter with the hashtag #StudyInTheUSA. Very briefly, Evelyn, could you explain the options for those who have a passport, a U.S. passport, or a green card?
Right, right. I personally encounter so many students today who have that background. So, and they ask me, should I apply as an international student or should I apply as a U.S. citizen? And I always say, if you have a U.S. passport or U.S. permanent residence in the United States, please apply as a U.S. citizen. One, you do not need a visa to study in the United States, so that saves a lot of things.
Yeah.
Two, you don't have work restrictions that would be imposed, and as we talked about earlier, on the student visa. But definitely, students who are U.S. citizens or have a permanent residence in the U.S. one thing I would recommend is make sure you also have a U.S. Social Security number. You may have been born outside the United States, you have a passport, you have a birth certificate, but you need to apply for a U.S. Social Security number, because that will be the key to applying for federal or state-sponsored aid. And this would be based on need-based financial aid. So students who have U.S. passports as well have the additional option to see if they qualify for need-based financial aid. Now, just a word about need-based financial aid. It's not a pure beca scholarship. The structure is usually going to be loans and or work study and or a partial grant. But loans, of course, will have to be paid back. But you have a privilege that unfortunately students who don't have a U.S. passport would not be eligible to apply for. And many universities will put a package together for the U.S. citizen, need-based financial aid and possibly merit-based scholarships. So the whole package together begins to help you finance your studies or look at it a little bit more realistically.
So thank you, Evelyn. Titus in the online chat writes, I've been accepted into a political science doctoral program, but the grant I was offered is far below what I need to be able to attend. Where should I look for funding? Evelyn, what are some of the ways that international students can get creative with their studies in the United States?
Right. Well, getting creative on a PhD level might be a little bit more restrictive than in some other fields, especially if the student has already been accepted to a program. One thing that I would recommend is Titus, that you contact the department and see if there's any way to negotiate in a very polite, diplomatic way to see if there might be some additional funding. I don't know for what timeline, if you've been accepted for the spring or you've been accepted for next fall already, but many times there might be end of the year, use or lose funding that is left over in a department's budget, where at this point they may not know the answer, but they may be able to add some extra money later on. So one way would be to ask the department directly if there's any way to increase that amount. The other way is to get a very clear indication if you are already coming in, if the student is already coming in with a master's degree from another institution, will the classes taken in the master's level count towards the requirements of the PhD at the new institution? Some universities may be very flexible and say, well, you know, if you already, by the time you get to us, have 24 credits of a master's from another school, that may shorten the time for completion of studies. Other schools may be rather more rigid and say, well, actually, with all due respect, since you haven't taken this advanced economics level class at our university, we're going to make you take it again. So one would be to, if you have a master's already, ask if those master's classes taken elsewhere could help shorten the overall length of time that you have to study. Another way to think creatively would be to ask, what is the maximum number of credits on the graduate level that I can take per semester? If the cost for tuition, whether it's 9 credits or 12 credits, is X amount, and you can load up 12 credits each semester, you may shorten that last semester somewhat by having taken more during the year. Now, this will depend on, of course, the requirements of the department specifically. Another strategy would be to study through the summer as well, but keeping in mind that maybe the scholarship that is being offered does not include summer, or it does. What it can do, though, is the overhead, the administrative, the living expenses, the costs of living. If you bulk it up and study continuously, you may be able to shave off a semester at the end. So on the PhD level, it's a little bit more restrictive on how creative one could get. But speaking with the department and being very upfront, say, I really want to be there. But is there something that could be perhaps that come down the pipeline? Maybe first year, you need to prove yourself. And they'll say, but you know what? Second year, we're opening up and we may have more money for you.
Thanks, good advice. There are a lot of different costs for international students to think about, no matter how they're financing their studies. How should students create a budget for themselves, and what are some good tips?
Right. Well, I think this is a subject that's very near and dear to my heart personally, because when we as university admissions representatives are reaching out to students, whether at the graduate or the undergraduate level, we're not just looking at the outreach, we're looking at the retention of that student. And there are several levels of retention. There's the academic retention. So when we're making a decision, we want to feel confident that this student can succeed in our program, whether it's an undergraduate or a graduate. But then we also are saying, fiscally, can they sustain themselves over the 4 years if it's an undergraduate, or 2 years, or 5 or 7 years if it's a PhD program. So the tips, one would be, as I mentioned earlier, planning ahead, having a really good conversation with your family, doing your homework, checking the resources in country through your EducationUSA Advising Center, through your Ministry of Education, if they're offering scholarship incentives, through any organizations. If your city has a sister city agreement with a city in the United States, maybe there's some interesting homestay opportunities that could save money. So some of the tips would be, and maybe I'll focus now more on the undergraduate side of the house, that all of the above, planning ahead, contacting EducationUSA, looking at opportunities to perhaps start at another institution that is less expensive, either in your home country or in the US, and then transfer. I always tell students it really doesn't matter when somebody asks you, where did you go to school? What they're asking is, where did you graduate? So where you started is the starting point. Where you end up is what you are going to be more or less talking about to the world. If a student is coming in from a system, an educational system of the British A-levels, the Caribbean CAPE exams, the French baccalaureate, the German Abitur, the IB programs, or AP high school programs anywhere in the world, many universities may have advanced standing policies that would allow the student to get credits for those classes taken if they meet the academic criteria. That can save money as well. It could save sometimes up to a semester, which could be translated into a lot of money at an institution. So one strategy would be check the policies of a university to see if they have advanced standing policies. Check and see if they have sports scholarships. Check and see if you're in the performing or the visual arts, if they have talent-based scholarships. Check and see if they have endowments based on diversity. And if you come from a background that is very interesting, you may be a unique person that they want to bring to that university. But strategy is think 4 years. Don't think 1 year to the next. Go in with a plan that is going to be a long-term sustainability, because we as universities want to have you there till you graduate and to be very proud of you when the student is our alum as well.
Thank you, Evelyn. We have a question from India asking about applying early for a master's program. Evelyn, how does applying early help international students in funding their studies?
Okay. It's an interesting question, and I'm not sure, certainly on the undergraduate level there is early decision, but as I mentioned earlier, with planning anywhere from 12 to 18 months ahead of time, the first thing the student needs to look at is what is the deadline of that university in that graduate program. The deadlines might differ from a major in the field of business versus the field of engineering versus economics versus political science. Each department may have different deadlines. Applying early and completing the process on time, if not early, is certainly to the student's advantage, because if anything is missing, the university may get back to you before the deadline and say, thank you very much, we've received X, Y, Z, but we're still missing these two other components. Please get those into us. An important thing to remember when applying is it's not just the application itself, it's whatever supporting documents, test scores, recommendation letters, statement of research objectives, all of those things, and possibly proof of financial resources in advance, depending on the school. So applying is not just completing an application form, planning early, getting everything in before the deadline allows the student to go back and double check if anything is missing. If a student starts the process early and is required to take the GRE and the TOEFL and the IELTS or GMAT and needs to take the exam again, starting the process early will allow them to have 2 or 3 chances to do that and not have to be up against a deadline and then kind of stuck with what you submitted without a chance to possibly improve that. So planning ahead is important. Early decision on the graduate level may not be what this question is asking, but planning early is very important.
Thank you, Evelyn. A participant on Twitter asks, what are the possibilities for scholarships and other funding for undergraduates in the performing arts field?
Right, okay. Well, again, that will depend on the university. So one place I would start again was go back to the EducationUSA Advising Center. There are online and book resources for different kinds of majors, first of all. So if a university has majors in the performing arts, and let's say you're a dance major, absolutely, there may be funding. It may not be full funding, but some kind of scholarship based on talent in the performing arts, whether it's vocal, dance, theater, etc. So ask the university, check with the advising center, and be ready to supply them with a sample of your work and performance. It could be in the form of a video, it could be a DVD, it could be that they have an alumni group that will sort of act as an audition panel for you to be able to perform in front of them outside the United States. So if you've got talent, there may be at some universities scholarships that really recognize that, but they will not necessarily be full scholarships, but they can help.
Thank you. Another question we get asked frequently is, what are some good resources or websites where I can learn more about loans, scholarships, and fellowships that are available?
Right. Well, certainly one place that I would look at is, again, the educationusa.state.gov, and look at the centers and look at the listings of various organizations and websites. There may be some loans available. Sometimes those loans will require a U.S. cosigner, sometimes not. But definitely, I would start with the EducationUSA website that will refer you to additional URLs that have scholarship opportunities there. Sometimes a university itself will possibly list other resources for non-U.S. citizens to look for possible other ways of funding, and check with your Ministry of Education if they too are offering some kind of funding opportunity.
Thank you, Evelyn. As we've mentioned throughout this chat, students should go to an EducationUSA Advising Center for assistance. You can find an advising center in your country by going to the EducationUSA website. I would also recommend, as an example, the United States-India Education Foundation website. Even though I know a lot of you might not be Indian nationals, the Study in the USA section of that website is a great resource that's helpful for everyone, and it also provides a lot of links to some of the resources that Evelyn talked about. Now back to our questions. Jonas from Pakistan asks, is there any support for students who can not afford to pay for the standardized tests international students need to take in their process of applying to U.S. universities?
That's a very good question and a very challenging one. One thing to keep in mind today is that out of 4,300 plus universities and colleges, not every university requires standardized testing, and here I'm referring to things like the SAT or the ACT, the SAT General and the SAT Subject Tests. There are hundreds of universities that have gone test optional or that have very clear policies for applicants outside the United States that those standardized exams are not necessarily required. The university will probably not pay for you to take the SAT if they require it, but with so many choices, you may be able to find a university that is an excellent fit for you that may not require you to take that exam. When it comes to proof of English language proficiency, that is a TOEFL or an IELTS examination. That is measuring English for non-native speakers. There, I would recommend to the student, depending what kind of schooling you came from, and this is a way, again, to avoid having to pay for these things, to have the student look at what are the policies of the universities, in the specific universities I'm looking at, on their proving English language proficiency. Some universities will say, if you have been educated for 9th, 10th, and 11th, and 12th grade in a completely Anglo-speaking environment, a British environment, a Canadian Anglo school, a US environment type of high school outside the US, we may not require you to submit a TOEFL or an IELTS score report. Others may say, that based on certain passports, they may be able to not have to take those exams. It is tricky because the standardized tests may be a requirement that the university has to put out there, but as we see a growing number of hundreds of universities not mandating those tests, you can get around those expenses as well. If you're lucky enough to be part of a program of a scholarship that may be offered by a government or an entity, sometimes those expenses are built into the scholarship program, not from the university, but from home country or another organization that may be an outside sponsor. But you can try to work around that by looking for schools that don't require you to take those.
Thank you, Evelyn. And as Evelyn said, checking the Education USA website is another great alternative because some Education USA centers have special opportunity programs for students who need funding to take those standardized tests. Absolutely. So I would definitely check with your Education USA center on that type of funding. Another online participant asks, if I'm offered a scholarship, will it be taxed?
Ah, yes, that's a good question.
Yeah,
and yes, it's probably, well, yes, you will be, depending on where the monies are coming from. If you are getting work study or if you're getting a graduate scholarship of sorts, you will be, a part of your scholarship may be held back for tax purposes, but depending, and I am not a tax person, so the one thing I would always say to a student is contact the International Student Office of your university because they will have a person who is better trained on tax information. They're not an accountant, but they can guide you. But in general, there are certain kinds of scholarships or awards where money will be deducted for the taxes. But at the end of the year, because the student is not earning above a certain amount, that money may be refunded. In any question like that, I would contact the university's International Students Center and make sure you understand what the obligations are and what the withholding taxes may be. What is the difference between the gross and the net? How much are you going to get in pocket every month if you're getting a stipend or an allocation from them?
Very good advice. A lot of our online audience is asking about financing for medicine, business, and other fields. Do international students have a better chance of getting scholarships and fellowships in some fields compared to others?
Oh my. Well, the study of medicine, if we can address that right away, is one of the most challenging for any international student, because the study of medicine and dentistry and veterinary medicine and law, unlike home countries, is not the same way. A student who wishes to study medicine, as you know, of course, has to do an undergraduate 4 years, then take an exam called the MCAT, the Medical College Admission Test, and then hopefully get into medical school for another 4 years, and then probably is going to specialize. So, you know, we're looking at 12 years from finishing high school till becoming an MD with a specialization. Funding for medical school is probably non-existent. I personally tell students, if you are absolutely set on doing medicine as your career, if you can study it in your home country and then come to the United States to do your specialization, your residency, your fellowships, where you could get some amazing opportunities. And again, the EducationUSA advising centers have information on how that process would work. But the expectation to get a scholarship to study medicine is very unrealistic, because the first challenge is to even get in, not even to think about getting money for it. But for the second part of the question, are there certain fields that might be getting more money than others? This goes back on the graduate level, that means master's and PhD, to the factor that certain departments may be getting themselves have a grant. So it could be that more in the sciences and the STEM fields, there may be more money available than in the humanities and social sciences. And that's a very broad generalization, because it really will depend that is it master's or is it PhD? There might be more money at the PhD in economics than there will be at master's in economics. Maybe the program is impacted. They only take 6 students into the PhD economics, but they guarantee that they will fund those 6 students. So it is major or field specific, and it then gets broken down to master's and PhD. But the first thing would be to ask the university's department about their funding structure. And of course, when you're applying, they may still be in the middle of a budget cycle or applying for their next budget cycle. Many graduate departments may say, you know, first year we want you to prove yourself at our institution and within our department. But if things work out well, we then guarantee that for your second and continuing years, there would be funding. So it will very much depend on the department's its own funding structure.
Yes, good to note each university is a little bit different. An online participant asks how his GPA or grade point average or test scores will affect his admissions and funding opportunities. Evelyn, how much do grades matter when applying for funding?
Oh, yes. Well, grades do matter, especially when a university is giving merit scholarships. The definition of merit is based on GPA, grade point average, but not just the numerical value. We look at the rigor of the program. If a student is in a program, let's say doing the British A-levels, and they have a lot of predicted A's with distinctions, they have excelled in that system, the numerical translation of the GPA from the British system to the American system may not sound perfect, but we look at the rigor as well as the GPA. So the quick answer is absolutely grades do matter, but it's grades combined with rigor. And for universities that are looking at testing, standardized testing, such as SAT or ACTs, they may have a specific range. They may not have a specific minimum, but they'll say the students who are receiving merit scholarships, the range will be between this and that. So the grades and the standardized tests, as well as proficiency in the English language, I would take it to the level almost of saying mastery. To be really deserving of a scholarship, not only must you have passed the TOEFL or the IELTS well as a non-native English speaker, schools like mine, we look at the way you write the essays, the way you communicate in your email correspondence, the way you write your supplements. So your ability to express yourself well goes beyond just a test score. It's, are you ready for academics? And if you are, and you've got the English, and you've got the academics, and you've got strong test scores if they are required, and maybe character is built into leadership and qualities, all of that could be an amazing profile for some kind of scholarship from a university that is looking first and foremost at academics together with those other factors.
Yes, so it's not the only factor.
It's not, but
just one
but
of
it is
many.
definite. If it's a merit-based scholarship, when a university gets 20,000 applications a year, there has to be a preliminary screening, but that academics together with rigor. So not just a 4.0 out of a 4.0, a 4.0 with a lot of, rigor, especially when we understand the various educational systems around the world that do not inflate grading. Many times they deflate the grading, and that is our responsibility at universities to understand how to interpret the context of the system from which the student comes.
Good point. Thank you. Another viewer asks, what does in-state and out-of-state tuition mean?
Okay, these are great questions. I'm
yeah.
very appreciative of them. So, in-state and out-of-state. First of all, that is how a university that is a public or state university describes its tuition. Funding for public universities comes from allocations from that state's budget. We go back to the decentralized system of U.S. higher education. There are 50 states in the United States. Every state has a certain number of publicly funded, publicly supported state universities and or community colleges, 2- and 4-year schools, and of course graduate programs as well. They get their money to fund that university from the taxpayer, the U.S. citizen who is a resident of the state, who is paying taxes to that state, who is proving that they are a resident. They have a bank account, some of the things. They have a bank account, they have a permanent address, they have a driver's license, they pay their taxes, they are a resident of that state. When a U.S. citizen is a resident of the state, they can benefit from the in-state tuition because they've made a contribution to that state. They get the benefits of the lower tuition when you prove you're a resident. When an American citizen comes from another state, from Florida to study in Texas, they are not a resident of Texas. They would pay out-of-state tuition. When the student is an international student, they too are not a resident of the state. They're not a resident of the United States. Therefore, they would pay out-of-state tuition. So when you, the student, are looking at a university that says in-state tuition is this, out-of-state is that, assume that you're going to pay the out-of-state. But the good news about out-of-state is that it still could be less overall tuition than a private university's overall tuition rate. So that's just something. Now, many times universities that offer fellowships or scholarships to graduate students will say, we're going to let you pay in-state tuition as opposed to out-of-state tuition. And that can make a significant difference of at least 50% reduction, and in many states, even more of a reduction. But assume that you are probably going to be out-of-state before you're going to be in-state tuition worthy, because you don't meet the criteria of being a resident of that state because you're not paying taxes, because you're not a U.S. citizen. But overall, it's still less expensive than private.
Thank you for explaining that. We have time for one last online question, and viewers want to know, Evelyn, what is your best piece of advice you want to leave our online viewers with today about how they can finance their studies in the United States?
Okay. Well, first of all, I think the value of a U.S. higher education is unprecedented. Its value globally, the piece of that empowerment, the overall holistic experience of being part of a campus environment, being part of a global network, meeting students from around the world at that university together with people from the United States, is something that you may not be able to get always in every place. So the U.S. university experience is a unique one. But the reality check also is one that you need to look at affordability of that education. So I look at that bottom line, perhaps, of the return on investment, the networking and the access to faculty and the empowerment that that student will receive from a U.S. education is so unique. Most places in the world may not offer such a thing. But as far as advice goes, would be plan ahead, be realistic, look creatively. There are so many ways. If you are a student who has good leadership skills, and let's say you've been a camp counselor in your home country for so many years, whether it's Seeds of Peace or another kind of organization, you could become a resident dorm advisor when you're in your 3rd and 4th year and look at ways of saving money on housing by volunteering to become a leader on that floor of the campus. So think creatively, but at the same time think realistically. Be sure to connect with the EducationUSA Advising Center in your home country. Do your homework well. Do not assume that because a place is expensive, it's got to be better than a university that is less expensive. Quality in the U.S. is not determined by the tuition that one pays. There are excellent universities that are less expensive, and of course there are excellent universities that cost a little bit more. So coming up with a short list of about 10 universities on the undergraduate level, and on the graduate level, read what the department is doing and try to find your niche. You need to tell them you're a good fit for them, and prove that through all the other requirements that they ask for. So I guess that's a lot of advice, but hopefully a way to begin the process.
Very good advice.
I wish them good luck.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but a big thank you to everyone who participated in our online chat and submitted these great questions. I would like to thank Evelyn Levinson, who has provided wonderful information for you today. And although this chat is over, you may continue to participate in our discussion on Twitter by using the hashtag #StudyInTheUSA. And don't forget to visit educationusa.state.gov for more general information. Also, please tune in to our next session 2 days from now on December 11th. During that chat, we'll discuss why studying in the U.S. is so valuable, even though it may be expensive, and how a U.S. education can help you achieve your career goals. Thank you so much for your interest in U.S. higher education, and we will look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.
Thank you.